Hello friends and welcome back to Julia at Home. This video is going to be about resources we use to study the American Revolution and the formation of the United States government. So this is actually part 2 of a video series I'm doing. The first part talked about colonial America from about Jamestown through the French and Indian War. Some of those resources I mentioned would also work really well with this, especially some of the extras. So I encourage you to go check out that video as well. We did this at the beginning of 4th and 2nd grade, and so it's aimed at elementary ages, but a lot of these resources can be used at any age. Now, I did use Curiosity Chronicles. This is the history curriculum that we use in our homeschool, and I enjoy it. This is Snapshots of Early Modern History, Volume 2. So if you watched the prior video, that was Volume 1. The chapters on the American Revolution are in Volume 2, and they are chapters 41 and 42. And those are the only ones I used in this unit from this book. But obviously, I wanted to cover it in much more depth, hence more resources. My father got me this. This is the Complete Guide to the Revolutionary War, and we didn't read it straight through, but it did come in handy to just like give us some more information on some pieces. So it starts here with the French and Indian War, and I mentioned this at the end of the last video, but if you haven't yet and you're going to cover the American Revolution, I would actually start with learning at least a little bit about the French and Indian War, because the reasoning for the American Revolution and why the colonists want to break away are related to the French and Indian War. So it really is a catalyst, so you understand what's happening as the American Revolution gets started. So it's mentioned in several resources, but it's also in here. So this goes through, it just has like spreads, like an encyclopedia, has spreads on different topics and events in the war. Here we go, here's for Ticonderoga. So yeah, it was just helpful if we were learning about something specific or a specific event, we could just turn to this and read that spread. So that's how I used it. Didn't read it all the way through, but we did use the spreads. Okay. This one is not a physical resource, but this ended up being really important to our study, so I want to mention it. It is the Revolutions podcast by Mike Duncan. Now this is aimed at adults, and so you might want to preview it and see how you feel for your kids. But I think it's a fantastic resource. So I love podcasts. I got it on my podcast app, so wherever you can get podcasts, you can get it for free. He has so many seasons now. The American Revolution is season 2. I think his first season is on the English Revolution with Oliver Cromwell and such. The detail it goes into on how the whole thing happened is wonderful, and he really tells it like a story so that you're like following the thread of what happened. And there were so many facts in there that I never knew, never learned, and I found that super fun. So we actually, it takes a while. It's pretty long. There's a lot of episodes. We actually listened to it on in the car. We did a field trip down to Boston as part of this, and I will come back to that later. But it's a several hour drive for us. So we listened to it on the way there and on the way back, and then I think we had to finish a few up at home. But I highly, highly recommend it. And we will be coming back to it for some other revolutions in history as we go on. Back to some books. This is George versus George. The American Revolution is seen from both sides. So obviously about George Washington and George III of England, who was the King of England at the time of the Revolution. This is also the king, if this is not kid appropriate, but if you watch Bridgerton, he's the one, he does go, I don't know what goes on with him, but he does go mad. He like loses his mental abilities after the war. And his queen was Queen Charlotte, who is featured in Bridgerton. Though that's not really fully historically accurate, just thought I'd mention that. Okay. So yeah, this, as I was talking about that, you can see that they go through kind of back and forth between the two Georges and how they lived, and then it goes into the American Revolution. So this is Concord here, Lexington and Concord, which was the first shots of the American Revolution. Okay, so George versus George, it's a good book to start with, and there's a lot of information in here, so that's a good one to have. Okay, now I really like to fill out my study with a lot of different people, and so I have Black Heroes of the American Revolution. This is not something you learn much about in school, or I didn't at least, and so this was really interesting. It's just learning about like exactly what it sounds like. Black, mostly men. I don't know if there's any women in here, actually. I don't think so. I don't remember being any women. But black men who helped the American cause during the Revolution. Then I also have Independent Dames, which is What You Never Knew About the Women and Girls of the American Revolution by Lori Halse Anderson. So it's not, okay, let me back up here for a minute. So this is actually has chapters on different people. One of the chapters is on like a bunch of people all together, but yeah, there's like, it's a chapter book about different people in here, as opposed to this one, which is, it kind of just talks about women in general in the American Revolution. And then it does highlight certain ones. Let me see if I can find. It says Oneida Chief Shenandoah sent Polly Cooper, an Oneida woman with 40 warriors, to deliver 600 baskets of corn to hungry troops, and so on. So it like highlights different. This is Margaret Morris up here. It does highlight different women, but it doesn't have like a whole page or chapter on them, if that makes sense. It's more cartoony, so it's not my favorite kind of illustration, but it is fun and it kind of makes sense for the book. So that's Independent Dames. Now, Paul Revere's Ride. This is the Longfellow poem made into a beautiful storybook, and I love the pictures, and I just really wanted to read it because it's a famous poem. And we also talked about how it's inaccurate. So, in case you don't know, so this is a famous poem. I'm trying to think of how it starts. It's a famous opening. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. So in this story, right, he goes and he warns the British are coming, the British are coming. In reality, he did not make it. He was actually captured on the way, and his friend got through and finished the ride, and did warn them. And he was, I think, released the next morning. But that's just an interesting side note. But it's a fun poem and beautiful pictures. We learned a bit about Lafayette because he is a fun guy to learn about. Now, this book is dense. We did not read the whole thing, so I kind of skimmed it and shared some parts with it, some parts of it with my children. Because yeah, I wouldn't recommend reading this whole thing through. I mean, maybe like high school, but yeah. But Lafayette himself is very, very interesting. So Lafayette. All right, now this was a fun heart one. This is called They Call Her Molly Pitcher. This is about Molly. It's a picture book. And she went with her husband to war, and she was fighting with him, and he got shot. Luckily, he was wounded, not killed at the time, but he was part of the artillery unit there, and so she just started doing his job. She had been, I think at the time, fetching water for the troops. And so she had like her pitcher of water. So she had been like just going out on the battlefield, like where the fighting was happening, and giving soldiers water. Hence Molly Pitcher. That Pitcher wasn't actually her last name, but she was carrying a pitcher. And then she just took over for her husband. And George Washington did hear about her, and I think he promoted her to sergeant. Oh, Molly Hayes, that was her actual name. But she's known as Molly Pitcher. And just kind of this heroic story. It was the Battle of Monmouth, so. Which was a very weird battle that we learned about. That's kind of a draw. It was kind of a mess. Charles Lee retreated. And Washington didn't want him to, caused some issues. Anyway, you can learn more about that. Look up the Battle of Monmouth. So a couple here. I actually showed this in my previous video, but there's this picture book on Benjamin Franklin. He's always good to learn about. So I'll just mention that here. This is the book we used for that. We did that earlier because he is quite a bit older. So for most of the time during the Revolution, he was actually in France negotiating with them to try to get funding, which was very important. And then he was instrumental in helping, he kind of moderated in some ways the formation of the Constitution. All right, I also wanted to share this one. This is Anne Story, Vermont's Heroine of Independence. So we live in Vermont. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to everybody, but because we live in Vermont, I picked it up. Vermont is interesting because Vermont actually declared its own independence at first instead of being one of the colonies. So it had, like, I think a couple of years where it was just the, like, independent country of Vermont. Anyway, she was, like, coming in homesteading at the beginning of this, towards the beginning of the war. Her husband actually died when trying to set up their homestead. So they were living in another town, and her husband and oldest son went out to their homestead property where they were going to build their house, and were cutting down logs to build the house, and I believe a log fell on him and he died. And her son had to go all the way back to town, which was like days worth of walking, and tell his mother that his father was dead. So really a harrowing story, but she picked up her kids and moved out there and basically did it herself. She did end up getting remarried a couple times, but she's known mostly for, she was like a waypoint, a shelter point for the Green Mountain Boys. So the Green Mountain Boys were under Ethan Allen during the American Revolution. They came from this area. She helped hide them from the British. So yeah, that's the story of Anne's story. It's a really fascinating story. She's a really interesting person, but I'm not sure that the book was written in the best way, in the most engaging way. So that's that. Okay. Next thing I want to recommend are these audiobooks by Jim Weiss. I love Jim Weiss audiobooks. So this is George Washington, First in the Hearts of His Countrymen. We've had this for years and listened to it many, many times, and it's a story of George Washington. So you can also find picture book biographies of him. There's several, but I really like this. I think it's really well done and well told and engaging. So that was basically our George Washington biography. He did fight in the French and Indian War, so we'll talk about the French and Indian War in here as well. And then this one is backwards. Hold on a second. That one was backwards. We fixed it. This is Thomas Jefferson's America, and this isn't just about Thomas Jefferson. It does talk about him, but it talks about more people too. So it goes through like the Declaration of Independence and how it was written, when he was the governor of Virginia with James Madison, and it talks about Marquis de Lafayette, when he went to Paris. So it does talk about him, but it also talks about some other people as well, and the formation of the United States government. Trying to think of where to go next. I think next I'm going to share with you the read-alouds that we did. So we started with this one. This is Chains by Laurie Halse Anderson. I just realized, so it's the same author that did the Independent Dames book. This is the first of, I think, a trilogy. We just read the first one. This is about an enslaved girl during the time of the American Revolution, and it is really, really good. I was nervous that it was going to be a little too heavy, but it's handled really well, and it did not feel super heavy. She ends up in New York City with the Tory family while it's occupied by the British, and she ends up being a spy. It's fascinating. There are obviously some hard and sad and violent parts to it, just the nature of slavery and war, but I recommend it. I thought it was really well done. Okay. That's Chains. So the follow-ups to that are Forge and Ashes, and actually my children did ask to read those at some point, so I'll probably get them and read them at some point, but not right now. Then we also read Johnny Tremain. So I wanted to read, there are so many good read aloud chapter books options on historical fiction for this subject, and so some of them might be better, especially the newer ones, than Johnny Tremain. However, I have a soft spot in my heart for the movie Johnny Tremain. It was one of those movies that my family owned when I was a kid, and it was, so I have fond memories of it. So we decided to read the book. It is so different than the movie. I mean, the basics are the same, but there are so many parts of the book that are not in the movie, and the ending's actually different. I mean, it ends after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and Johnny survives, but anyway, so I would recommend, if you're a fan of the movie, to read the book. And so we actually read the book and watched the movie and then compared the two, which was really interesting. So, and if you don't know anything about this, I should share that Johnny Tremain is like a young teenager who is a silversmith's apprentice at the beginning of the book, but then something happens and he can no longer be a silversmith's apprentice in, Revolutionary War Boston. So there you go. I also will share that I got the Brave Writer Arrow guide to Johnny Tremain. So I did this with my 4th grader, and it talks about different literary and grammatical things. And it was actually a really interesting one because of how the language, especially the imagery, repeats and shifts and changes during the book, and I wouldn't have recognized that without this. So I'm going to mention that I enjoyed this. I think this would have been one of my favorite Brave Writer guides we've done. I also want to share this. We didn't get to this one. I had too many read aloud books to get to. So this is Sophia's War, and it's about a girl who becomes a spy for, I believe, the Americans, and her brother was a soldier. So, yeah, Sophia's War. So I can't say whether or not this is good. It had good reviews. You can check it out. It's by Avi. Now, I actually have some books that my daughter, my 4th grader, read to herself. So this is History Smashers, and I wasn't intending to give this to her to read to herself. I was going to read this to the kids. However, my dad gave it to us as a present early. I like to tell my parents what we're going to be studying in advance, so that they like to buy a lot of books and stuff so that they can look for books on that topic when they're buying gifts. So he had gifted this to her early, and she actually read it without me asking her to. So she had already read it, and so I decided that was fine, and my son didn't need to read. He can read it when he's older. Next time we go through it, he can read it. But it's really interesting. She told me all sorts of stuff in it. Let me see. So it's a chapter book, but let me show you the contents there. So there's lots of pictures, and there's some like comic book style parts. So it's basically stories that you wouldn't have heard from that, or things that are inaccurate. This is the story of Crispus Attucks. He's actually the first person shot at the Boston Massacre. And he was of African and Native American. Yeah, he's the son of a Wampanoag woman and an enslaved African man. He's fascinating. They had an exhibit on him in one of the museums that we went to in Boston too. But anyway, yeah, just lots of good information here. There's more History Smashers, so I'll be looking to see if they have any relevant to the other, history areas we're doing. Continuing on with books my daughter read. So these are ones that I assigned to her that she read, and then I don't think she did a written narration. I can't remember if she did a written one or just told me her narration for these, but this is Traitor, The Case of Benedict Arnold. Yeah, this is actually a pretty advanced one. You could look at that there. But she flies through reading, so she got through that pretty fast, and so I then gave her Who Was Abigail Adams, which is a lot, the Who Was is a lot easier to read. So those. Now, I just found this and realized I think I forgot to assign it to her, so I might actually assign it to her at the beginning of this next school year. This is a Dear America series book, and it's Love Thy Neighbor, the Tory Diary of Prudence Emerson. And I believe these are historical fictions. And I think I got this one because we had a lot on the Patriot side, and we didn't have a lot on the Tory or British side, and it really was split more than, like, when we talk about it now, it doesn't feel like it was a split. It feels like everybody was on the Patriot side. Only a few people were on the Tory side, but that's not really true. It was really like the first Civil War here for the United States. So yeah, I thought it would be nice to have a Tory perspective in there. In fact, I mentioned in my last video that I am a descendant of Quakers who came over with William Penn, and Quakers are pacifists, and so they generally are against fighting and against wars, and there were some exceptions who did fight, but my family, from what I can tell, did not. So I don't know if they were just neutral or if they were in fact Tories. So there you go. So we also moved on from the revolution itself and the fighting to the writing of the Constitution of the United States and the formation of the government. And the Revolution podcast does cover that, and that, like, it makes it's so interesting. So I have a couple books. I have We the People, The Story of the Constitution by Lynn Cheney here, which I've had this book for a while. I think we read it when they were younger too. And it's really interesting. It kind of gives you the perspective of how it was a negotiation and really a compromise that happened. There's also We the People, the Constitution of the United States. And this is, I believe, the preamble. Let me see. It does the preamble and, like, shows things that it's talking about and, like, highlights the United States. So this is just, like, it's an older book. I don't know if you could even find it anymore. Yeah. So that's what that is. So that's just kind of like an add-on. And that's We the People by Peter Spire. So they're very different books, and this one is the better one to get. And then this is kind of a silly one, but Magic Treehouse to the Future, Ben Franklin. It's number 32. So again, I showed you the Ben Franklin autobiography, and he was older at the time of the Constitution's writing, but he was very involved in that. And so this book takes place kind of at that point when they're working on the Constitution. So I included it when we got there. I also just talked my kids through not every part of the Constitution, but the Articles 1, 2, and 3. We talked about the 3 different branches of government, and then we talked about the Bill of Rights a bit. I actually went to law school, so I did add a little bit on from the resources I had just from what I know myself. The resources don't usually get into the Supreme Court, and then at the founding they hadn't really established judicial review as we think of it today. That was in an early decision. So that the fact that the Supreme Court reviews the constitutionality of laws. So anyway, we got into that a little bit, but just based on discussion. I do have some more things I want to show you and talk to you about, though. First, I have this Famous Figures, the American Revolution. This is just for fun. You can kind of make, I don't know if puppet's the right word, but you connect them with fasteners. I don't remember what those are called. And they're they're more advanced paper dolls, and the different people have them in color and then blank so the kids can color them in, and they're perforated so you can tear this out. But I do like to copy mine so that we can continue to use these resources, and because sometimes my kids want the same person and all that. So it just has, famous people from the time period. Oh, see, Molly Pitcher's in here. She's got a picture. I'm not sure that would have been the kind she had in the battlefield, but nonetheless. I got, I think, 2 from this group. Okay, so this is the Sons of Liberty, A Delightful Recreation. I have 2 CDs by the Sons of Liberty, and it's just mostly instrumental. I think there's 1 sung piece of music from the time period, and it's really, I enjoy it. So I have 2 of their CDs. I think the other one's in the car. And I got those from the Townsend site. Now, they have a YouTube channel that I'll link below, which is fantastic. You can go down so many rabbit holes. He does a lot of recipes, but he also, he does just a lot of lifestyle thing and what it was like to live during that time. So it's not so much on the history of the revolution and such, but on what everyday people were doing during that time, what they were eating, how they built their house, how they got water. He has one on digging a well. I just found that interesting. I was watching that one. And they also have a company where they sell a lot of things related to that time period. But I did get these CDs, I believe, from them, along with, I splurged a bit on a fancy ink pot. And I think I got the India ink from them too, that I have in here. And I played with the quill and the ink. I invited my children to, and they didn't really want to, so I played with it. So both the channel and the website for Townsend will be linked below. I also have a Professor Noggins game on the American Revolution. I've mentioned these ones in videos before. I quite like them, and I don't know if I always show you, so I should probably show you more carefully. So they're just cards. They're basically flashcards on different subjects, and then they have different questions in the back. So the subject of this card is heroes, and then there are 6 questions in the back. The green is the easier and the blue is the harder, and has the answers at the bottom. And it does come with a die, and you're supposed to roll the die to figure out what question you're asking at the particular level you're playing. And then I think if you get it right, you keep the card. We do it at dinner, and we just go around and we ask questions. Sometimes we ask one, sometimes we ask multiple from a card. And it's just for fun and learning, and I enjoy them. So yeah. We have a bunch, we'll rotate through, and I actually might pull these out for dinner tonight, just for fun to review them. Now, if you do live anywhere on or near the East Coast of the United States, I highly recommend seeing what you can find in your area for field trips. We went on several field trips for this unit, and it was the best thing we could have done. So we are not far from Fort Ticonderoga, which is in New York State. And there's some really interesting things that happened there. Yeah, it was originally built by the French during the French and Indian War. Then it was taken, when it was Fort Carillon or Fort Carillon. I don't know exactly how they pronounced it. And then it was taken over by the British at some point, and they renamed it Fort Ticonderoga. During the American Revolution, it was taken by the Americans for, I think, about a year, and then taken back by the British. It's fascinating. So much good history there, and they do events. So I think we went like 3 times last year because they had a homeschool day that we went to. That was super fun. They had like extra people doing different things and different learning activities there. And then we went to a reenactment of Brown's Raid. And they do different events each year, and each year sometimes some of the events are the same, but each year they choose like a year that they're portraying. I believe it was last year they actually did it starting as British, so like the first half of the year was British and the second half was American. It was either that or first half was American, second half was British, but it was fascinating. So they actually did like the battle in the middle where it changed hands, and then they switched who they were. I have found all the people there to be super helpful. So if you're anywhere in that area, that is a great field trip. I highly recommend it. But again, like look for what's in your area. There's also around here, Mount Independence is actually right across the lake area. On the Vermont side, there's Mount Independence, and at some point during the war, there was a bunch of troops stationed there. It's actually beautiful hiking trails at any time of year, and there's a little visitor center there. But we went, I think they do it every year. They have a Soldiers on the Mount Day where they have reenactors there, and they actually have like different, you can like walk through and they teach you about what happened. And it was fantastic. There were some Green Mountain Boys there. I am rambling, but my point is that there are lots of places you could go to. I also do want to touch on a big one that you could do if you're anywhere in the Northeast or if you want to travel is Boston. Obviously, that was like the start of the Revolution, really a lot of the early events that we learn about leading up to the actual revolution happened there, and the first battle at Lexington and Concord happened there. So we did do a field trip down there. We spent a weekend, and we went down, we saw Lexington and Concord, which are 2 towns outside of Boston where the first battle took place. And these are featured in Johnny Tremain and some other resources we had as well. And it's the famous first shot heard around the world was in Lexington. And then at Concord was the first British soldier shot in the war on the bridge there. And then we did the Freedom Trail. I actually still have my guides that my dad went with us. He's really into history, so it was fun. Family time, and he bought me these guides. And you can take like guided tours that they do, which seem like they're excellent with the little people and their like focusing power. We just did it on our own, so we could just like just like focus on a few of the places that we wanted to, and then kind of be flexible. I had a really, really good time. And then we also went to the Boston Tea Party Museum, which is a newer museum. They didn't have that when I was a kid there. It's a little pricey. But it's really fun. It's really interactive. Like you go in and it's like you're in the meeting at North Church that happened before the Boston Tea Party happened, where they're like calling you to action, and you can like say things. You have like cards of who you are. Anyway, fascinating. The kids or anybody who wants to can then throw things over the boat. They have like these light pretend things of tea on ropes. You throw them over and then they haul them back up. And then you go through like a little museum thing. So anyway, it was a fantastic, fantastic trip. Between that and listening to the Revolutions podcast, like I don't know if we even needed all the rest of these resources, but nonetheless, I do recommend them, and they are good. I already told you about Townsend's, which I will link below, but I also, again, wanted to mention Max at Tasting History because he always has great videos related to recipes and history. And then there's so many rabbit holes you could go down in history, or really any subject. And over the past few years, I've been especially interested in what people wore and how like fashion and clothes have changed. And there are actually so many people on YouTube even just doing like free work on sharing with you what people wore at the different times. And so I've watched some of those. I would love to make myself a full like 1700s, I guess 18th century outfit, and I actually started it last winter, but this is clearly not the right season of life for me to do that. So maybe give me a couple of years and I'll do that again. But I'll link some of my favorite videos on that below so that you can check it out if that's a rabbit hole that you want to dive down. And I want to finish up the video by showing you a bit of my daughter's unit book. So this was a unit book that we used from the colonial times through the founding of the Constitution. So it kind of ranges in time. America's from around 1600 to around almost 1800. I showed the parts that were, pre-American Revolution in the last video, so you can check that out. But we started here with the American Revolution. We started with a timeline. I don't know how well you can see that here. And this is something I wrote out for them and then had I had them copy. I think I wrote some of it for my son. For the 2nd grader, but my 4th grader, this is hers. And then I just had her do drawings and sometimes written narrations for different things. So some of the things she could just do a drawing for and then tell me about it, and other things she wrote out. So I believe this is the Boston Tea Party. She should have labeled it. You might go back and do that. But you see people throwing tea off a boat, so I assume that's what's happening there. It's about the Boston Massacre. And I mentioned in a recent video, I do encourage her to ask me how to spell things, but if she spells a lot of things wrong, I don't make her go back and check it, because the point was that she remembered, she paid attention to what happened, remembered what happened, and then wrote it herself in her own words. So I leave the spelling and I come back to that later. So yeah, Boston Massacre. Oh, she did write a little bit about the Boston Tea Party here as well. So, oh, there's just a picture to go with each. Okay. I didn't know before doing this with my kids is that there were actually 3 ships involved in the Boston Tea Party, not just one. Okay. Lexington and Concord here. I don't think I had them do a narration because we visited this, and so I was asking them here in Fort Ticonderoga like what they saw. So she saw a gun, cannon, and oxen, apparently. It's actually a pretty good drawing of the fort there. This is the 3 branches of government that we talked about. And yeah, so this is just the basics. Ooh. I talked at them about much more, and we'll come back to it when they're older. There's a lot more details to get to, but I do want them to have an idea of how our government works. And then at the end of this unit book, I did something I hadn't really done before, and I'll see how I'll probably use this on and off for different things. But I did like I wanted to wrap up the unit somehow and make sure we were retaining and absorbing the information. And so I asked questions, and then I put lines in here for her to write her answers. So they're basically written, it's kind of like a mini exam. It wasn't like timed or anything. But so the first question was, what led to the British colonies breaking away from Great Britain? She got a pretty long answer there. What was the first battle and what year was it? What was the last battle? Describe another battle of your choosing. It looks like she chose Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen taking Fort Ticonderoga, which the British surrendered without there being any violence. I'm sure violence was threatened, but it did not occur. Then I asked them to choose 2 figures from that time period. And so she did George Washington and Molly Pitcher. Then I asked, what was the first federal government created by the revolutionaries? How was it created and why did it fail? Now, I think this is an important thing to learn about if you are learning about the formation of our government. It is the Articles of Confederation was the first government, and it gave the federal government very, very limited power, including it didn't have the power to tax. And this caused a lot of issues, and I think it's really relevant to know that we tried that for some time, and it kind of was a disaster. And there's more complexities to it as well, but that's like the really simplified version. But I feel like that's important to know when we're talking about government today as well, because sometimes these conversations circle around. I asked, who created the current government of the United States? How is it different from the first? What influenced its creation and form? And what problem did it make unaddressable for 25 years? And she was actually able to answer all that pretty succinctly. I was going for some very specific things here. So the people who wrote the Constitution were actually the people who were more in favor of a stronger centralized government, because the people who weren't kind of boycotted the Constitutional Convention. So they were able to give a stronger federal government and the power to tax, and it was influenced by Britain, Rome, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I really wanted her to note that, because we did learn about the Haudenosaunee, often called the Iroquois, and their confederacy. And if you look at their confederacy, you can even see how the United States was inspired by that. And there were delegates, including, I believe, Benjamin Franklin, who did visit them. And then I wanted them to remember the Constitution made it so they could not do anything about slavery for 25 years. She made a little unhappy face in there. Whew, that was a lot. I had so much fun during this study. This is one of my favorite things to study, so I may go a little bit overboard with it. And I hope this has helped you. Hopefully you will have some fun learning about American history as well. I hope you're all well. Have fun learning and have fun with your kids. Bye, friends.